The 18-year-old boy who falls out of the transport truck looks entirely different. His skin is tinted an unnatural, toxic shade of yellow, and he is sweating profusely despite the freezing winter wind. When the camp doctor rushes out to examine him on the dirt road, the boy begins to vomit a dark, terrifying liquid that eats away at the snow. The doctor leans in to check his breathing and recoils immediately, hit by a sharp, chemical odor radiating directly from the boy's pores. The immediate medical exam reveals that his liver and kidneys are completely shutting down. But what shocks the American staff is the unmistakable smell of advanced experimental rocket fuel. The scene starts at the intake gates of a sprawling United States prisoner of war camp deep in the American Midwest. Thousands of captured German soldiers are being processed after surviving the brutal ocean crossing from Europe. The guards are working quickly, checking tags and matching names to transport lists, when a sudden commotion breaks the routine. An 18-year-old prisoner named Elias steps down from the back of a truck and immediately collapses onto his hands and knees. He tries to push himself up, but his arms give way, his body trembling violently as if hit by an invisible electrical current. Two guards rush over to pull him to his feet, expecting to find the usual signs of severe malnutrition or common camp diseases. As soon as they grab his arms, they notice that the whites of his eyes are stained a deep, sickly yellow. His skin carries the same terrifying jaundiced tint, a clear biological alarm that something inside his body has gone critically wrong. Even more disturbing is the strange, acidic smell coming off his uniform, an odor that smells nothing like the mud and sweat of a typical battlefield. The guards waste no time asking questions and immediately drag his limp body toward the camp hospital for an emergency evaluation. Inside the bright, whitewashed walls of the camp hospital, the head doctor takes one look at Elias and immediately orders him onto an isolation cot. The doctor has seen countless cases of combat trauma and camp diseases, but acute organ failure in an 18-year-old requires a specific trigger. He begins a rapid physical examination, pressing down on the boy's abdomen, which is rigid and painfully swollen around the liver. When a nurse uses a catheter to check his kidney function, the fluid that comes out is as dark as strong coffee, signaling massive internal toxicity. The boy is dying rapidly, and his body is frantically trying to flush out a poison that the American doctors cannot immediately identify. The doctor leans closer to examine the boy's chest, trying to find any hidden wounds or infections, when the strange chemical smell hits him again. It is a sharp, biting scent, similar to ammonia mixed with concentrated bleach, radiating directly from the prisoner's sweat glands. This is not a biological disease, but a massive exposure to an industrial chemical that is currently dissolving his internal organs. The American medical staff stand around the cot in shocked silence, realizing this teenage prisoner is carrying a highly classified substance in his bloodstream. We are currently in the emergency ward of an American prisoner of war camp. Now, we must go back a few months to a hidden forest in Germany to see how this boy was poisoned before he was ever captured. Let us know in the comments where you are watching this from. Are you in the United States, Germany, the United Kingdom, or somewhere else? If you want to dive even deeper into these untold stories, consider becoming a channel member. You'll get your name mentioned in the video, early access to videos, exclusive content, and direct input on which stories we cover next. Join our inner circle of history keepers. 6 months before his arrival in the United States, Elias was just another German teenager drafted into a collapsing military machine. However, instead of receiving a rifle and being sent to the freezing trenches of the Eastern Front, he was loaded onto a covered train in the middle of the night. The military needed strong young men for a highly classified project hidden deep within the dense forests of northern Germany. When the train doors finally opened, he found himself in a heavily guarded, camouflaged facility completely hidden from Allied bombing planes. He was not going to be an infantry soldier, but a forced laborer in the desperate, secret program racing to build advanced terror weapons. The facility was dedicated to fueling and launching experimental rockets, weapons that ran on highly volatile and incredibly dangerous liquid chemicals. Elias was assigned to a fueling crew, forced to handle heavy hoses pumping a highly corrosive mixture of methanol and concentrated hydrazine. The German officers in charge wore heavy protective suits and gas masks, But the teenage conscripts and forced laborers were given only basic rubber aprons and thin gloves. They worked exhausting 12-hour shifts in poorly ventilated bunkers, constantly breathing in the sharp, acidic fumes that filled the damp air. Nobody told the boys that the liquid they were pumping was not just explosive, but profoundly toxic to human organs. The disaster that sealed Ilya's fate happened during a frantic late-night fueling operation as Allied planes circled miles overhead. The crew was ordered to move faster, rushing to disconnect a pressurized hose from a massive storage tank hidden under the trees. A faulty valve snapped under the pressure, spraying a thick cloud of the toxic rocket fuel directly over Ilya's and two other young workers. The liquid soaked straight through his thin uniform, burning his skin instantly like a swarm of angry wasps. He scrambled backward, ripping the wet wool off his chest, but the highly solvent chemical had already absorbed directly into his pores. A camp medic quickly rinsed him with cold water, treating the exposure as a simple chemical burn and slapping a bandage over the reddened skin. What the medic did not realize, or perhaps chose to ignore, was that the hydrazine and methanol compound was now racing through the boy's bloodstream. The poison began a silent, destructive journey toward his liver and kidneys, the organs responsible for filtering toxins from the human body. For the first few days, Elias felt completely fine, assuming he had survived the terrifying accident with nothing more than a painful rash. He did not know that his internal organs were slowly being cooked by the most advanced rocket fuel on the planet. Less than 2 weeks after the chemical spill, the secret forest facility was hastily evacuated as the front lines collapsed completely. Elias was handed a rifle he barely knew how to fire and ordered to march westward with a disorganized column of retreating soldiers. By the third day of the march, the silent poison inside his body began to make its presence known through a wave of crushing fatigue. He felt a deep, agonizing ache in his lower back, exactly where his kidneys were struggling and failing to process the highly toxic methanol. He gritted his teeth and kept walking, knowing that anyone who fell behind on the brutal winter roads would be left to freeze. As the days dragged on, the whites of his eyes began to take on a faint, sickly yellow tint as his liver started to shut down. The other soldiers in the marching column kept their distance, put off by the strange, bleaky smell that seemed to seep from his uniform when he sweated. He stopped eating the meager rations of stale bread, completely overcome by a profound nausea that made every step feel like walking through deep water. Every breath he took felt like inhaling broken glass, but the fear of being left behind by his unit forced his legs to keep moving forward. When his unit was finally surrounded by an advancing American tank division, the surrender was quick and completely devoid of heroics. The German soldiers threw their weapons into the deep snow and raised their hands, shivering in their ragged winter coats. As the American infantrymen moved in to search the prisoners, one soldier grabbed Elias by the shoulder and immediately stepped back in alarm. The American shouted for his sergeant, pointing at the terrifying yellow color of the teenager's face and the strange chemical vapor rising from his collar. The troops briefly panicked, fearing that the boy was a deliberate biological trap sent to infect the capturing army with a contagious plague. An American field medic was rushed to the front of the line, keeping his distance while he visually inspected the trembling boy. The medic quickly determined that whatever was destroying Elias was internal and likely chemical, not a contagious airborne virus that would threaten the platoon. Elias raised his hands and collapsed into the snow, trading the deadly battlefield for the unknown future of a prisoner of war camp. The Americans loaded him onto a transport truck separate from the healthy prisoners, marking his paperwork with a heavy red stamp indicating a severe, unknown medical crisis. The transport chain that moved captured German soldiers across the ocean was a grueling ordeal even for a healthy man. The prisoners were packed tightly into the dark, freezing holds of massive cargo ships, spending weeks listening to the groan of metal and the crash of ocean waves. For Elias, the journey was an absolute nightmare, trapped in the dark while his internal organs systematically failed one by one. His skin turned a deep, undeniable yellow, and his body swelled as his kidneys stopped producing urine, trapping dangerous fluids inside his tissues. He lay in his narrow bunk, slipping in and out of consciousness, muttering in German about a burning fire deep inside his stomach. Because the ship was overcrowded and understaffed, The American guards assumed his terrible condition was simply a severe case of seasickness or camp jaundice. They gave him sips of water and told him to rest, completely unaware that his body was saturated with experimental weapons-grade chemicals. The toxic buildup affected his brain, causing terrifying hallucinations where he was back in the secret forest, drowning in a sea of hissing rocket fuel. By the time the transport ship finally docked in the United States and the prisoners were loaded onto trains, Elias was barely clinging to life. His arrival at the inland camp was not the end of a journey, but the beginning of a desperate medical crisis. We are now back in the camp hospital in the United States, watching the American medical staff scramble to save the dying teenager. The head doctor orders immediate intravenous fluids, using the primitive medical technology of the 1940s to try and flush the poison from his system. The nurses attach glass bottles of saline to his arm, running the fluid continuously in a desperate attempt to force his failing kidneys to work. Every hour, they check his output, waiting anxiously for the dark, coffee-colored urine to clear, but his body stubbornly refuses to respond. The chemical smell in the isolation room grows stronger, turning the medical ward into what smells like an industrial laboratory. The doctor pulls the camp commander aside, explaining that this is not a disease, but a massive exposure to an unknown, highly advanced chemical agent. The commander realizes instantly that an 18-year-old boy smelling of strange chemicals might hold the key to the most advanced German weapons programs. He immediately picks up a secure telephone line and calls the regional military intelligence office, requesting an officer who specializes in secret weapons. The medical emergency is no longer just about saving a life, but about securing highly classified intelligence before the prisoner's failing heart stops beating entirely. An intelligence officer arrives at the camp less than 12 hours later, carrying a briefcase full of classified reports on the German rocket program. He walks directly into the isolation room, ignoring the terrible smell, and stands over the shivering, yellow-skinned boy. The officer confirms to the doctor that the chemical odor matches the exact description of the highly volatile fuel used to launch advanced missiles. The American military has been desperately hunting for the hidden factories producing this fuel, and the dying boy in the bed knows exactly where one is. The doctor warns the officer that Elias might only have a few hours left to live, turning the interrogation into a frantic race against absolute organ failure. The nurses are ordered out of the room, leaving only the doctor, the intelligence officer, and a trusted military translator. The officer pulls a chair up to the metal cot, opening his notebook to a blank page and clicking his pen. He stares at the dying boy, fully aware that the terrifying chemical destroying the prisoner's liver is exactly what makes the enemy rockets fly so fast. The intelligence officer knows he must be careful, because pushing a patient in profound organ failure too hard could trigger a fatal cardiac arrest. Elias is drifting through a fog of pain and toxicity, his eyes glassy and unfocused as the officer begins asking rapid, targeted questions. The officer wants to know the exact location of the rail lines, the camouflage netting, and the underground storage tanks where the accident happened. He offers Elias a simple, impossible trade, promising the best medical care in the country in exchange for the exact coordinates of the secret rocket facility. Elias, barely able to lift his head, whispers the name of the dense forest and the small railway junction hidden beneath the trees. The information is gold, exactly what the Allied bombers need to cripple the remaining rocket attacks striking European cities. The officer writes furiously in his notebook, pressing for more details about the fueling process and the protective gear used by the German scientists. Elias answers a few more questions before his eyes roll back and his body goes entirely limp, slipping into a deep, toxic coma. The intelligence officer closes his notebook, looks at the camp doctor, and tells him to do whatever it takes to keep the boy alive. The prisoner is no longer just a defeated enemy, but a highly valuable asset holding the secrets of the most terrifying weapons of the war. To understand the true horror of what Elias experienced, we must look at the numbers behind the secret German rocket program. The advanced weapons were technological marvels, but they required massive amounts of highly unstable liquid fuels to break the sound barrier. Tens of thousands of forced laborers and drafted teenagers were forced to handle these toxic chemicals in underground bunkers across Europe. The mortality rate from chemical exposure, explosions, and sheer exhaustion in these facilities was incredibly high, killing more people in production than the rockets killed as weapons. For every missile that successfully launched, dozens of young men absorbed deadly toxins directly through their skin and lungs without any medical treatment. The chemical compounds were so corrosive that they could eat through ordinary clothing in seconds and dissolve human tissue upon contact. A human liver can process many things, but concentrated methanol and hydrazine destroy the cellular structure, causing irreversible failure within weeks if left untreated. Elias was just one of thousands of anonymous casualties of this secret war, carrying the lethal cost of advanced technology across the ocean in his own blood. If you are enjoying this story and want more untold accounts from World War II prisoners of war, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We are bringing you stories that most history books never covered. Back in the camp hospital, the doctor initiates a brutal, relentless treatment plan to force the boy's kidneys to restart. Without modern dialysis machines, the only option is to flood his system with intravenous fluids while administering primitive diuretics to force urination. The nurses stand by the bed around the clock, constantly changing out the heavy glass fluid bottles and monitoring his dangerously erratic heart rate. It is a terrifying balancing act, because giving him too much fluid could flood his lungs, while giving him too little guarantees his organs will completely shut down. The chemical smell in the room remains thick, a constant reminder of the invisible poison they are fighting to flush away. For 3 agonizing days, there is absolutely no change in his condition, and the yellow tint of his skin darkens into a terrifying shade of olive. The intelligence officer calls the camp daily, checking to see if his vital asset is still breathing, while the doctor prepares for the inevitable end. The camp carpenter even receives quiet orders to begin preparing a wooden coffin, assuming the boy's severely damaged heart will stop beating before the week is over. Elias lies in the bed, completely unresponsive, a silent casualty of a high-tech war fought with poisons he never understood. On the morning of the 4th day, a nurse checking the catheter bag notices a sudden, miraculous change in the output. The dark, coffee-colored fluid has lightened to a murky brown, and the sheer volume has doubled over the last few hours. The doctor rushes into the room, checking the boy's pulse and finding it stronger, steadier, and less frantic than the days before. The massive fluid therapy has finally breached the blockage in the kidneys, allowing the damaged organs to slowly begin filtering the deadly rocket fuel from his blood. The chemical smell in the room begins to dissipate, signaling that the highest concentration of the toxin has finally passed through his failing system. Later that evening, Elias slowly opens his eyes, blinking against the harsh glare of the hospital lights. His vision is blurry, and his throat is incredibly dry, but the crushing, agonizing pressure in his lower back has slightly receded. The doctor leans over the bed with a genuine smile, using the translator to tell the boy that his organs have narrowly survived the absolute worst of the crisis. Elias closes his eyes and takes a deep, slow breath, realizing for the first time in weeks that his body no longer feels like it is burning from the inside out. He has survived the poison, the march, the ocean, and the fever, clinging to life by the absolute thinnest of margins. As Elias is moved out of the heavy isolation room and into the general recovery ward, his presence creates a wave of unease among the other prisoners. His skin still carries a distinct, ghostly yellow hue, a visual marker of the profound organ failure he just barely survived. Rumors spread quickly across the barracks that the young boy is cursed, or carrying a highly contagious plague that the Americans cannot cure. Many of the older German soldiers refused to look at him, instinctively pulling their cots slightly further away from his corner of the room. The isolation from his own countrymen is a bitter pill to swallow, adding a heavy psychological weight to his physical recovery. The American medical staff, however, are the only ones who know the incredible truth about the teenager's toxic ordeal. They make sure his meals are brought directly to him, ensuring he receives extra sugar and simple carbohydrates to help his liver rebuild its reserves. Elias spends his days quietly staring at the ceiling, feeling like a ghost haunting his own life, trapped between the world of the living and the chemical death he escaped. The other prisoners eventually realize he is not contagious, but the invisible barrier created by his terrifying yellow skin remains firmly in place. The physical recovery process is incredibly slow and agonizing, spanning several months inside the camp hospital ward. Ilya's skin remains lightly tinted for weeks as his liver slowly regenerates and repairs the massive cellular damage caused by the hydrazine. He is kept on a strict, bland diet of clear broths and boiled vegetables, his stomach too damaged to handle the standard, heavier camp rations. The American guards, who once viewed him as a sickly burden, now treat him with a strange kind of awe, knowing he survived an incredibly rare poisoning. The intelligence officers never return to question him, satisfied that the coordinates he provided have already been heavily bombed into dust by Allied planes. As he regains his strength, Ilyas begins to slowly walk around the hospital grounds, his steps shaky and cautious. He looks out through the barbed wire fences at the sprawling American landscape, feeling completely detached from the terrible war raging in Europe. He knows that many of the boys he worked with in that hidden forest facility likely died from similar chemical exposures, their bodies failing silently on muddy roads. The scar on his chest, where the chemical burned through his uniform, remains a permanent, physical reminder of the deadly secrets he was forced to keep. When the war finally ends and the camp begins the long process of repatriating the thousands of German prisoners, Ilyas prepares to leave. The camp doctor gives him a thorough final examination, marveling at the resilience of the young human body to repair such catastrophic organ failure. The doctor hands him his medical file, filled with complex notes about toxicity and fluid flushes, proving to any future doctors exactly what he survived. He tells Ilyas that he must never drink alcohol and must protect his liver for the rest of his life, because the damage from the rocket fuel will always be a hidden vulnerability. Ilyas nods, deeply grateful to the American doctor who refused to give up on an enemy soldier reeking of poison. He boards the train leaving the camp, looking out the window at the wooden guard towers slowly fading into the distance. He is no longer the dying, yellow-skinned boy who collapsed in the dirt, but a young man carrying a profound understanding of survival. The journey back across the ocean is peaceful, completely unlike the terrifying nightmare he endured in the dark hold of the prison ship. He knows that whatever hardships await him in the ruined cities of post-war Germany, he has already faced a far more silent and deadly killer. When Ilyas returns to his homeland, he finds a country completely shattered by the same advanced weapons programs that nearly killed him. He reunites with his family, who are shocked to see how thin he is, but overjoyed that he survived the chaos of the collapsing front lines. He does not talk much about the secret forest, the rocket fuel, or the terrifying days when his organs stopped working in an American hospital. He simply focuses on rebuilding his life, taking careful care of his health just as the American doctor instructed him to do. Walking through the rubble of his childhood city, he sometimes catches the scent of industrial chemicals or burning fuel from the reconstruction crews. Every time that sharp smell hits his nose, his heart races, pulling him right back to the terrifying night the storage valve broke. He finds a quiet job working in a local administrative office, far away from any machinery, heavy industry, or toxic materials. His survival remains a deeply guarded family secret, a private victory against a war machine that viewed teenage boys as completely expendable fuel for its rockets. Decades later, the heavy curtain of classification surrounding the advanced weapons programs is finally lifted by international historians. The world learns the terrible truth about the forced laborers, the underground factories, and the deadly toxic chemicals used to launch the rockets. Documentaries are broadcast showing the horrible conditions in the hidden forests, confirming everything Ilyas had kept locked inside his memory for years. He reads the news reports with a quiet sense of validation, realizing that he was not just an isolated victim, but a survivor of a massive, systematic tragedy. He finally shares the full story with his grown children, pulling out the faded medical file given to him by the American doctor at the prisoner of war camp. They read the complicated medical notes detailing his massive organ failure, shocked that their father had ever been so close to a toxic death. The revelation brings a new level of understanding to his quiet life, proving that true survival often requires carrying the heaviest burdens in absolute silence. Elias realizes that the coordinates he gave to the American intelligence officer likely helped tear down the very facility that poisoned him, a small measure of justice delivered from a hospital bed. Looking back at his incredible survival, the medical staff at that small camp hospital deserve as much credit as the resilient teenager. They were faced with an unprecedented chemical crisis in a prisoner of war, and instead of letting him die, they utilized every primitive tool they had. The intelligence gathered from his poisoned body helped shorten the war, saving countless civilian lives from the devastating rocket attacks. It is a strange irony of history that a deadly accident in a German forest led directly to crucial intelligence in an American prison camp. The legacy of Elias' severe organ failure is a testament to the complex, deeply human stories hidden behind the barbed wire of the 1940s. Behind the grand narratives of generals and major battles, there are countless individual battles fought in quiet hospital rooms and dark ship